States.
So help you God?
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
When I was being recruited in March of 2008, it was heading to the final year of President Bush's term in office, and they're concerned about how they leave the department, and it would be the first transition of Homeland Security that existed. And so they wanted to make sure that they left Homeland Security and Human Resources in the best shape possible.
We will not apologize for our way of life, nor will we waver in its defense. And for those who seek to advance their aims by inducing terror and slaughtering innocents, we say to you now that our spirit is stronger and cannot be broken. You cannot outlast us, and we will defeat you.
In fact, what I was told before I arrived was, Tom, you're going to see things that you saw in human resources or personnel 20 years ago. The government is in one of those phases where they haven't really moved into the 21st century, if you would, within HR as it relates to hiring practices.
The Department of Homeland Security analyzes threats and intelligence, guards the nation's borders and airports, protects critical national infrastructure, and coordinates the nation's emergency response. It takes people to do that. A lot of people. In fact, the DHS will need to fill more than 65,000 mission-critical jobs by the end of 2012.
Just to add some perspective, because everyone doesn't necessarily remember, but when TSA was taken over from private sector to the public, that organization grew to 55,000 people. And that's approximately where it is today. Within Customs and Border Patrol, they existed, but they also grew to 65,000. And there's around 218,000 individuals within Homeland Security. They had fallen behind in their recruitment efforts and had a backlog, and they were very concerned.
So what kind of backlog are we talking about that you walked into?
There was the number of positions that were vacant at that time in a backlog of about 500 jobs. It would not be atypical for a particular job posting, if you would, to generate 1,400 applicants. Those resumes and those applications would all be printed and all have to be physically reviewed by an HR professional along with operations people. And that's just one job. So can you imagine for 500 positions, similar types of responses that you would have? Also, there's a system within the federal government that many private sector organizations have gone away from, which is in the federal system, it's called classification. Each applicant, once they would be narrowed down, a classifier would have to review that application to determine what grade level they would actually qualify for. Critical element in hiring in Homeland was that people needed to have and be cleared to come work for Homeland. Some required security clearances, but all required a background investigation. So there were parts.
Was that a bottleneck? The background investigation, is that one?
It was one of the avenues of the handoffs, if you would. So the process was that we handed that off to our security department, and then that applicant went into what I called a little bit more of limbo land, because there was no one holding that applicant's hand. And so what we did was we formed a tighter relationship with our security department and said, we will own that process. So when someone completes their paperwork to go through a background investigation and to be cleared to come in, we will stay with that client. And that was either we, HR, or we, the customer. So we no longer left it to where it just went into the process. The federal government process is atypical, that if a resume that you typically see in the private sector, a 1 or 2 pager, doesn't get it done in the federal government, that there still is more that needs to be added, that the way the evaluation process happens right now is all on paper. It's not me as an HR person looking and seeing, oh, you know what, they worked at XYZ company and they have applicable talent.
What do you make of some of the test or pilot programs where they've eliminated the great essay writing requirement in the senior executive service? Do you support that idea?
I support the idea. What needs to happen within that is what happened within the private sector. The same thing occurred where now, in terms of being, I was no longer a paper pusher or a pusher of resumes. I was now an HR professional being asked to evaluate that applicant. And in the federal government, that's not necessarily happening in the front end of the process by an HR professional, because there is an assessment part of the process that's more towards the back end, which I mentioned, which was the classifier. But the classifier is looking at level of experience to determine the level of the GS rating. Sometimes people are not interviewed, and the application is viewed, and an offer sometimes could be made just on the basis of the paper that they see. So my advice, say to a new person coming in, I would say looking at the process for how can we make it automated, how can we look at the touch points of the evaluation and the classifying that needs to be done, how can I move that element to the customer and get decisions made quicker and faster, and how can I move them through. So I would say you can make an impact. Obviously, any organization attracting and hiring talent is a critical part of that.